Okay, folks, we're going to get started. So I'm Amy Huffman. I'm the Policy Director for the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and we're so glad you're here with us today. I'm not going to talk much right now. I'm going to pass it over to my friend Angela Bennett, the Digital Equity Director for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and she's going to give us a little bit of background about the Digital Equity Act, why we're here today to talk about their new request for comments, and some other information about why this is super important for all of you all. Okay, Angela?
All right, thanks a lot, Amy. Welcome, everyone. As Amy shared, my name is Angela Bennett. I am honored to serve as the Digital Equity Director under the U.S. Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, which is different from NDIA, and I'm the Angie to the Angela from NDIA. So my pronouns are she and her, and special thanks, first of all, to Amy and NDIA for translating our request for comments and for hosting this listening session. So before we jump into the RFC, I want to just kind of level set on where are we in the Digital Equity Grant Program. So right now, all of the states have received their Digital Equity Planning Award grants and are in the process of developing their state digital equity plans. You can go to internetforall.gov, click on the state, and it will tell you who your contact person is for your state broadband office. It will also provide you with the contact information to the state federal program officer within NTIA that serves that particular state. So I encourage you all to find that information and make sure that you get a seat at the planning table while your state is developing their state digital equity plans. They have 12 months to develop these plans and submit them to NTIA for the capacity grant program, which will be released in early 2024. And so that states will submit their plans to apply for $1.44 billion to implement their state digital equity plans. Afterwards, we will begin developing the competitive grant program, which is $1.25 billion. And so for those that have not, so long as you have not served as an administering entity for the capacity grant program, you are eligible to apply. Those on this call are eligible to apply for our competitive grant program. So, political subdivisions, Indian tribes, foundations, corporations, not-for-profit entities, that are not a school, community anchor institutions, local educational agencies, and the list goes on and on. So why is this RFC so important, and why, is NDIA hosting a listening session? It's because it is your opportunity to have your voices heard and to help inform how we develop the capacity and competitive grant program. It's your chance to ensure that we hear from you on how should we evaluate the success of the programs. For the BEAD program, which is our, sister program or brother program, in that Evan is the director of the BEAD program, which is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which is $42.45 billion. And that's to ensure that we are connecting each home to high-speed, reliable, affordable internet. It's how are we going to ensure that equity is being achieved in the BEAD program. So thank you for joining, and thank you for, participating and ensuring that your voices are heard. If you have any questions, you can always email us at digitalequity@ntia.gov. And with that, I will hand it back over to Amy. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate you. Okay, so I already saw a question. Yes, this is being recorded already. After this webinar, we will post it on our website in a blog post. We will also post the slides that accompany this. And as I am going to pull those up. Just give me one moment, folks. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the RFC, or the request for comments. This is a webinar, so we're really just walking through the request for comments, again, talking about why NTIA published it at this time, where it sits in the broader suite of programs. And oh, my presenter name is Amy Huffman. I go by she, her pronouns, and my title is policy director. Apologies for that. We'll get that fixed before we put it online. And then if we have time, we'll take questions. Later on, we are inviting NTIA back for a listening session. So today we won't be hosting a listening session. This is more of an information session, but we're inviting them back for a community call. And if you would like to join us, we'd love to have you. And one of my colleagues, I'm sure, can put in the chat the date and time of our community call so you can join us. So if you're not familiar with us, NDIA, or the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, we got started about 8 years ago to represent you, the folks on the ground across the country, doing digital inclusion work day in and day out. We now today have over 1,200 affiliates in 49 states, including the District of Columbia, and with 12 tribal organizations. And we offer a mix of different opportunities and resources, but first and foremost, operate as a community. So we have webinars like these and community calls where we get to talk with you all about the work that's happening on the ground. And we learn from you all so that we can turn around and help other people in their work that are new to the field or have been doing this for some time and would like to learn new things. We also take what we hear from you all and take it to policymakers. Things like around the Digital Equity Act or Affordable Connectivity Program. We take what we hear from you all to make sure that your voices are heard in Washington. And we do some awareness and data and research as well. Okay, and before we dive into things, just to situate ourselves, there's some definitions. When we talk about digital equity, that's our goal. That's where we want to arrive at. That's what we would like to achieve to make sure that everyone can thrive. And digital inclusion then is how we get there. It's the programs, the policies, and the tools that help us get to digital equity. Okay, so just a reminder, in 2021, you might remember, but it actually has been some time now. So President Biden signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or what is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill. On some of NTIA's different materials, you'll see bill. On other things, you might see IIJA. So you should just be familiar with both, but just know it's the infrastructure law that President Biden signed into law. And it included within the broader infrastructure package, right? There were monies for airports and roads and railroads, but within that broader package, there was $65 billion set aside for internet and internet-related things, including $2.75 billion for the Digital Equity Act, and that's what we're going to mostly talk about today, but also $42.5 billion for that brother program that Angie talked about, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And that's to make sure that there's access across the country to unserved and underserved locations. Also, importantly, is the $14.2 billion for the Affordable Connectivity Program we all know and love. And by the way, need more funding for it in order to make sure that this program doesn't sunset. And there was also money for the Tribal Connectivity Program to increase and expand that. A middle mile program was implemented, and then there was, some of you all know, a section included that Congress asked the FCC to create rules to prevent digital discrimination in the future. So today we're going to talk about these two highlighted programs, the State Capacity Grant Program and the Competitive Grant Program, that are part of the broader Digital Equity Act program. Just a reminder that the Digital Equity Act programs, there's actually $2.75 billion total, but it's split across 2 programs and 3 grants. So the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program has planning grants, which have, as Angie mentioned, all gone out the door already to states and territories by the end of territories are still getting their funds, but states by the end of last year. And that was 60 million. And now once states and territories and eventually tribes submit their plans, then it'll be time to implement those plans. And that's what the capacity grant program is. And then eventually there was a competitive grant program, right? Where organizations like yours to apply directly to NTIA for funds to implement your digital equity programs or really great new ideas, right? So this is the updated timeline. We're looking at where are we right now. All states have received their funds and should have their plans into NTIA by the end of this calendar year. And then next spring, the capacity awards will open up for the states to begin implementing their plans. And then after that, next fall, we're looking at the competitive grants to open up and for application for you all to apply directly to NTIA for your own implementation projects. Now, we're not going to go through all of the plan requirements that have to be inside the state's digital equity plans that, again, remember, they're going to be submitting by the end of this calendar year. We have a lot of resources on our website that I'll point to in a moment with lots of links. Again, after the webinar, you can click through and find everything where you can find more information on what actually has to be in these plans. But as a summary, they're supposed to provide a clear vision for what each individual state and territory believe digital equity looks like in their state, right? And that is supposed to be co-created with community. So with you all to design what the vision for digital equity is in your state. Then there's some statutory requirements. In other words, things that Congress wanted states to include in their plans. And then also some additional requirements that NTIA added to make sure that the plans actually made sense. So things like, oh, you made it come up with all these measurable objectives to achieve digital equity. That's great. How are you actually going to implement those things? And so NTIA added a couple additional requirements. Again, if you would like more information on what should be in our plan, in a digital equity plan, we have that information on our website, and I'll point to more links in a moment. But I did want to highlight one area that's super important that both Congress and NTIA really want states to focus on when they're creating their plans. And by the way, when I say states, I do mean states, territories, and tribal organizations, because they will all be creating plans at some point this year. But Congress really wanted states to focus on what they call covered populations. And they defined 8 different types of covered populations that states should design, basically better understand how the digital divide impacts these folks, and then design solutions for the digital divide for them. And so when we get into the request for comments, this is important because there's lots of questions geared at, well, how do you serve these specific individual covered populations? How do you actually design a program around getting devices to veterans, right? So that's what the type of detail that we need to get into in some of our comments, and by our, I mean collective we, when we're talking to NTIA about how they should go about writing the rules for their next programs. Okay, so again, here are some links to our website that provide more information, background on all of these programs, what they are, what they mean, as well as our state digital equity planning toolkit that was for states and territories, and to help provide best practices and guidance in writing their plans. Okay, so as Angie mentioned, NTIA opened up their request for comments to get input from you all on how these 2 programs should be designed. Remember, the capacity grant program and the competitive grant program. What should they look like? How should they measure for success? That sort of the thing. And so the requests for comments are open for 60 days, which ends on May 1st at 5 p.m. Eastern. So I recommend setting an alarm on your calendar for 4:50 Eastern to make sure you get your comments in on time. And again, the comments are going to inform that $1.44 billion program, the capacity grant program, and then that $1.25 billion program, the competitive grant program. Here is a link to the RFC and where you can also submit comments. And then as Angie said, you can submit questions to digital equity at ntia.gov. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to go through all the questions and break them down for you and what they mean, and maybe even provide a couple ideas of what a comment would look like. But just some general best practices, start early. So if you haven't already read the request for comments, you're in a good spot because we're going to go through it right now. So you're basically going to read it now. But after this, take some homework to print it off, read it through. I promise it's only when you print it, it's only like 6 pages. Read through it, underline some things, figure out where your expertise aligns with the questions that are being asked and what your where your organizational alignment is and where your priorities are, right? And highlight those questions. And then tell NTIA what you know, because you know a lot. You have a lot of information. You've run programs for years. Take what you know and write it down and provide answers to NTIA and into each question. Make sure when you do so, you're citing your work. You're citing, if you've ever done a program evaluation, cite that link to it. Make sure that you're showing where things worked and maybe even where things didn't. So if you ran a program and it wasn't successful, why wasn't it successful? And why should NTIA not lean that way when they're funding programs, that sort of thing. And make sure, again, going back to my kind of joke, but not really joke, set an alarm, make sure you submit these on time, because if you don't submit them before the deadline, your comments basically don't count. So all the hard work you put in doesn't count. And lastly, you don't have to answer every question. There are 24 questions. Some of them are questions embedded with questions, and you don't have to answer them all. You can literally only answer one, or you can maybe even not answer any. You just give a general statement. So just make sure though that you do provide your expertise. Make sure we're guiding NTIA on how they can best implement these programs. Okay. So there are, again, 24 questions that are split into a couple different buckets. So the key themes and the key buckets are, first, how should NTIA assess the state digital equity plans? What makes them successful? What does a good plan look like? Then how should NTIA advise or guide or require states to implement those plans? And then how should NTIA implement the state digital equity competitive grant program? What does that look like? Angie listed off who's eligible, but there's even a question about who's missing, right? Who's missing that should be eligible for that type of program? How should they measure for success and transformative impact? This is a really big section within the request for comments that NTIA really would like a lot of guidance on, because this is really important. We need to make sure that these programs are successful and we're measuring for the right things so that these programs can be continued. We need funding to continue and to be sustainable, right? And then importantly, as Angie alluded to, how do we align the digital equity and broadband equity access and deployment program? They have to be aligned, right? How do we make sure that they are? How does NTIA make sure they are? How do states make sure they are? How do the rest of us hold those folks accountable, right? And then how importantly, again, getting back to that transformative impact, how do we think about ensuring that, how does NTIA think about ensuring that both the BEAD and DEA programs create economic and workforce opportunities, particularly for covered populations? In other words, how do we make sure that these programs have lasting economic change, transformative, generational impacts, right? And how does NTIA hold the grantees accountable for that and actually equip them to make sure that those programs are doing that? Okay, so that's where we're going to go. We're going to walk through each question. And what we've done is we've actually written the entire question on the first slide. And I promise I'm not going to read them verbatim for you. But then on the second slide, we've broken it down a little bit into a bit more bite-sized chunks so that we can talk through what those mean. And so we're going to take the rest of the time to do that. And if we have time at the end, we'll go through some questions and answers that, and if we have answers, we'll provide them for you. Okay. So again, the first section is assessing state digital equity plans under the Digital Equity Planning Grant Program. So remember, NTIA has already allocated funds to states to create their state digital equity plans. All of the states have already received their funds as of the end of the calendar year last year, and they're all under, like, in maybe in a different phase, but they're all underway in creating these plans. So most will be due by the end of, all of them will be due by the end of the year. So what guidance should NTIA and or each state provide to enable communities to review and provide actionable feedback to states regarding the state digital equity plans? So that's the first question. In other words, states have to post these plans for 30 days on their websites. And how should they ask communities to provide input into those plans? And then what criteria or factors or outcomes should those communities focus on when they're reviewing the plans and providing that feedback to the states? And then how, in addition to all of that, how can NTIA ensure that states and territories consult with tribal entities and how best to meet tribal members' needs? So that's question number one, which again, as you can see, is actually a multi-part question. Okay, moving on. This is the second question. And when we break it down, basically, NTIA has already been providing under Angie's team and actually multiple teams. She mentioned the federal program officers. So each state and territory has a point person that they can go to talk to about, ask nuanced questions about the Digital Equity Act or the BEAD program and how to meet guidelines and timelines and et cetera, right? So they've already been providing quite a bit of technical assistance. So they're asking, in addition to what they're already providing, what additional guidance or resources should NTIA provide to states, territories, and tribal entities as they develop their plans? So what, if you've heard from your states what they need, this is the place to put that. And then again, what additional guidance can NTIA provide to states and community organizations as you seek to use other federal tools like the Affordable Connectivity Program? So for instance, I just had someone ask me the other day, is there a template for how you align the Affordable Connectivity Program with the DEA plans or the BEAD plans, right? That might be something for NTIA to create, and this might be a place to ask NTIA to do that. And then finally, how can individuals and communities provide feedback to states, territories, and tribal entities to ensure their unique communities' needs are reflected in the digital equity plans? Okay, so moving on to the capacity grant program. This is the question. Broken down in thinking about the capacity grant program, really NTIA is asking, how should they define success for the program? So once the program is fully implemented, how would we know it's been successful? What outcomes should we be measuring to make sure that we know it's successful, that we can actually say, put a flag in the ground and say, this was a roaring success, right? And then how should NTIA measure the success of the capacity grant program? And what do those measures and methods look like? And again, just a reminder, the capacity grant program are the funds that will implement the plans that the states are creating right now. Okay, question 4. So again, thinking about the capacity grant program, how should NTIA design the capacity grant program to ensure that equity is achieved? This is a super broad question, so I encourage you to get creative in your response here, but also, again, encourage you to go back to what you know. How does the work that you do achieve equity in your communities, right? That's super specific. That's super important for NTIA to know as they design this capacity grant program. And just a reminder, when we talk about equity, we don't mean equality, we mean equity. Sometimes equity means investing in communities of color with more financial resources to make sure that there is actual equitable opportunities and outcomes. Okay, the next question, number 5, again, regarding the capacity grant program, is what criteria and factors should NTIA take into consideration when they're assessing whether the states, territories, and tribal entities are meeting the stated goals of the digital equity plans? So remember, in the digital equity plan, states will be creating goals and also that vision for digital equity. So how does NTIA hold the states accountable for actually achieving that, right? And figuring out whether they are. What measures do they need? What data do they need to gather? What metrics do they need to develop? And how do they do so, both short term, thinking within 1 year or less, or even long term, because these grants will be implemented for the next 5 years. In regards to that, because these grants will be being implemented for the next 5 years, and states and grantees will need to report to NTIA on the implementation of these programs. What reporting requirements should NTIA establish to make sure that not only are they getting information about how the plans are being implemented, but also that what reporting structures can they put in place to make sure that the voices of those who are being served and who are most impacted by the digital divide, that their voices are reflected in the updates that they get about whether the plan is being implemented or not, and how it's being implemented. So in other words, how does NTIA make sure that they're hearing from the people throughout the course of this implementation? And what steps, if any, should NTIA take to monitor and evaluate the implementation practices of the states and territories? And then in addition, when thinking about the future of these plans and making sure that the work that comes out of them is sustainable and lasts for a long time, and we're creating large ecosystems, and the work doesn't just end after these programs, what role can collaborations, partnerships, and coalitions play to make sure that these programs are sustainable? Okay, I know this is a lot. Again, we will post the slides so you can walk back through these things and think critically about each of these questions as you're drafting your responses. But again, as you see, this is a multi-part question, right? We're looking at reporting requirements, and then how NTIA should monitor, and then how should these things be sustained, right? How will these programs go on into the future? Okay. Question 7. Again, is a bit of a broad question, but I do encourage you to think about, again, from your perspective, your organization, what the work you have done. The Assistant Secretary today is Alan Davidson, who sits at NTIA, but are there any rules that he should develop or NTIA should develop to ensure that digital equity is achieved in the capacity grant program? So think about, again, what you would like the capacity grant program to look like. And then if NTIA needs to develop any rules to make sure that that happens. Okay, so we're moving into the competitive grant program, which is the program for organizations across the country. And really remember, a lot of different types of organizations are eligible to apply. The competitive grant program, again, grantees or potential grantees would apply directly to NTIA for the funds. This request for comment will inform the future notice of funding opportunity that NTIA will publish. And they expect, based on the current timeline, to open that up sometime next fall. So fall 2024 would be around the time you would have a chance to begin applying for this program. So this section of questions are geared towards creating that competitive grant program. So again, thinking we talked about this with the capacity grant program, but what does success look like? How should it be defined? What outcomes are most important? Do we care that everyone has access to affordable internet? Or do we care that everyone has access to devices? What do we care most about, right? All of those things, we want holistic solutions, but what are those specific outcomes? How do we measure it? And is there data currently, or do we need data to back those things up? Are these measures any different from the capacity grant program? Are they the same? Are there some that are the same, some that are different? And that question's on there twice. Oops, see, done already. But we do recommend that you be super specific in your responses to these specific questions, but all of them in general. Okay, next one. What sorts of activities or projects should the Assistant Secretary consider for inclusion in eligible projects and activities for the competitive grant program? So lots of you are running digital equity programs right now. Should those be eligible types of projects? Probably. So you probably want to outline what those types of projects are in this section. Again, back to still on the competitive grant program rules. In the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Congress has already listed a long list of types of organizations that would be eligible to apply for these competitive grant funds, including community anchor institutions, community-based organizations, nonprofits, not schools, as Angie alluded to earlier. And then importantly, the administering entity for the state digital equity capacity grants, they are not eligible because they've already received funds, right, from the capacity awards. But it's a long list. So I encourage you to look at that list and see if anyone's missing, or if there are organizations that might be missing that you think should not be eligible. This is the place to put that too. Okay. And then again, this is super broad, but thinking about, again, rules, if there are any rules that the Assistant Secretary or NTIA should develop to make sure that digital equity is achieved in the competitive grant. So again, thinking about your experience and your organization's goals and how you're working within your own community to achieve digital equity, are there any rules that should be in place to make sure that this program gets at its desired outcome, which is digital equity? It's setting up systems to make sure that digital equity can be achieved in the future. What rules should be in place to make sure that happens? Again, recommend you add in your own experiences here and things you think that would be helpful. Okay, so NTIA, of course, is going to get a lot of applications for this program. So they want to know how they should score it. What sort of rubric they should design to score the applications to ensure that the programs that they end up funding reach the desired goal of setting up digital equity ecosystems and making sure that we have holistic and solutions across the country. So they want to know what factors, elements, criteria they should think about to make sure that funding is equitably distributed, and also raises up the importance of serving the covered population specifically. So if you have ideas around program scoring, rubrics, things you like when you've applied for grants in the past, rubrics that you felt are super fair, or if you've come across any that are really, you feel unfair, provide that as an example of things that they shouldn't do, right? Sometimes examples of things that shouldn't be done are just as useful as things that, as positive examples as well. Okay. So again, thinking about program scoring, are there any specific evaluation criteria that NTIA should have? And should any of these criteria basically be worth more points or have more weight or more value when they're evaluating applications for the competitive grant program? And again, if you have any examples, providing those examples, those studies, those measures is super helpful to NTIA. Okay, question 14, should projects be weighted that align with this? Should projects that align with the state, territory, or tribal entities' digital equity plans receive more weight? How should they be considered? Should it be considered whether if they align or don't align? So basically, NTIA wants to know how they should think about those projects that are or applications that come in that do align or don't align, and whether those should receive any additional consideration. Okay, so now we're getting into measuring for success and transformative impact, right? So this is the next section of the request for comments where NTIA would like your input. Okay, so question 15. What are some examples of past or current digital equity or inclusion projects or other relevant or similar projects? So this is really where your experience is so important. What is it you do day to day in terms of working towards digital equity, your programs? Can you give like, this is where you lay out, this is what we do, this is how we do it. Do you have any evidence for what is effective and how you increase or how you reach efficacy with your programs? Do you have any program evaluations you've done over the years? Include that here, but make sure that you include all the different types of projects and programs you've run over the years. If you haven't run any programs, perhaps this is where you lean on your friends who have and you cite programs that they've run, or of course, remember that you can always skip questions. So if you don't have direct expertise in running a digital equity program, you can move on and not answer this question. Okay, question 16. So again, thinking about measuring for success and transformative impact, how should grantees define digital equity with respect to each of the covered populations? What does success look like for each of the covered populations? Remember, we covered populations, it's 8 different covered populations, veterans, minority-led households, etc. And then how should NTIA measure the effects of access to and adoption of and meaningful use of the internet for each of the covered populations? And to what extent should grantees disaggregate data within each of the covered populations to reveal the underlying trends and pattern? So basically, NTIA is asking, for the covered populations, how do we make sure we reach digital equity for each of them? How do we measure whether that works? And you, as a potential grantee or potential grant applicant, how do you want to present data to NTIA? Do you want to disaggregate it? Do you want them to do it for you? This is where you would provide that sort of input. For instance, if you're looking at adoption of internet amongst minority-led households in your specific state, let's take Louisiana, for example. Do you, as the potential grant applicant, want to have to find and disaggregate that data and report on it? Or would you like NTIA to provide it for you, or the state? This is where you provide that input. If you think that data is going to be really hard for you to find, you should say that, and you should say why. This is where you want to put that information. Okay. Question 17. Again, thinking about measuring for success and transformative impact. So what metrics and performance data and even data governance strategies or tools are needed, right? We've long lamented in this field that we don't have enough data to really prove that these programs are working, or to really understand the gaps across the country. For instance, we really don't know a lot around digital skills across the country, who has what level of skills. So what data do we need to really be able to track success for these programs? Again, this is the place to put that. What are some benchmarks? How do we track progress? That sort of thing. Okay. We're in the home stretch, guys. There's only 24 questions, or there's 24 and we're on number 18. We're almost there. Thank you for hanging with me. So again, thinking about measuring for success and transformative impact, how should NTIA measure grantees? And how should, so every potential grantee will have to provide reports to NTIA. They just have to. It's part of federal grant making. You have to provide performance reports and interim reports and track progress. So how should NTIA monitor that? And what should they require? And should they create standardized metrics and measures so that they can understand national trends? Or should they let the grantees or future potential grantees design those metrics, right? So this is your place to provide input to those things. Okay. And then for each of the covered populations, are there any proven strategies, tactics, projects, or programs that promote or achieve digital equity? So if you have experience in working with one specific type of covered population, and you know that working, say, with older adults is a lot different than working with currently incarcerated individuals, right? Like the programs and the projects that work to close the digital divide for older adults is a lot different than currently incarcerated individuals. So, but what works, what doesn't work? This is the place to provide that input. And then also, in addition to this, are there any studies you've done, or studies you know of, or things that guided the way you designed your program? Were there things, outcome-based measures or impacts that you can share from the programs that you've run, or the due diligence you did in setting up your programs? So this is the place to share all of that type of information. Okay. So number 20, getting in again into measuring for success and transformative impact. How can NTIA encourage and measure the effectiveness of investments in our youth and young adults? They're particularly interested in this because youth and young adults can be part of nearly any of the covered populations, right? So want to make sure that we're thinking about how to ensure these programs work for them. And then thinking again about this population, but others as well, what should be the baseline or the standard for digital literacy or digital skills for all learners? Again, we've talked a lot about this in this field, that there's not a national standard. There's not a national system of measuring progress for digital skills. So how do we do that? What should the standard be? What should the baseline be when we're thinking about measuring progress? And then in addition, should the intended outcomes be based on a type of standard which includes varying levels of digital skills, or should it be something completely different? So if you have experience with working with learners and different types of learners and teaching digital skills or running programs that teach digital skills, this is definitely the question you want to weigh in on. Dream big here, folks. This is the place to think about what this structure for measuring digital skills and making sure that everyone has access to them, what that should look like. All right. I think we're down to 2 more sections. So now we're going to talk about making sure that E stays in BEAD, that equity. So number 22. So again, states are required to make sure that their broadband equity access and deployment program and their Digital Equity Act programs align. But how should they align? That's the question. And how should they align those planning efforts to make sure, and then the subsequent implementation of those plans to make sure that particularly the equity gaps for the covered populations are really taken care of, I guess, or addressed. So NTIA wants to make sure that the BEAD program isn't quote unquote bad, right? That it includes equity. So how do they make sure that they do that at NTIA and make sure that the states and territories do that? And then in addition, how can NTIA work with the states and territories to promote the collective impact and the interactions and the outcomes of these 2 sister programs so that equity can actually be achieved for those covered populations specifically? Okay, last section. Ensuring workforce and subcontracting opportunities are inclusive of underrepresented communities or covered populations. So just a note here, in the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, states are required to serve underrepresented communities. Those communities almost nearly 100% align with the covered populations that are outlined in the Digital Equity Act that we already talked about. And I forgot that I have a handy slide here to show again who the covered populations are. Remember, there's 8 types of covered populations, and states are required to create plans around serving these folks. Okay, so question 23. How can NTIA encourage the design and implementation of digital equity programs to increase economic mobility for those covered populations, both to support the BEAD implementation and to achieve broader economic outcomes? So within the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, there are a number of different workforce requirements, but also opportunities. So if you think about all these new broadband networks that'll be coming online, that's jobs. How do we make sure that those jobs go to folks within the covered populations? Well, there's going to need to be trainings that are associated with those, right? So how do we make sure those trainings are there? So think about things like that. So again, if you work with one of the individual covered populations, what are the types of programs that they need in order to access the jobs that the BEAD program is going to spur with all these new investments? But then beyond BEAD, what are the other types of future opportunities that open up to a person once they have digital skills, right? So how do we make sure that there's a link between these programs and the broader economy? Who are the other industries that need to be at the table? Who are the other industries that need to be talking to the other folks working on these issues about the skills that their organization will need a year from now, 5 years from now, the type of workforce it will need to thrive, right? These things need to be synced and linked, and this is the place to talk about what those things look like. And if you have any experience in workforce development, upskilling, reskilling, this is definitely the place to add your expertise. Okay. Finally, what kinds of programs, projects, and partnerships, again, thinking about the youth, would prepare them with the digital skills that they need to be workforce ready, right? If you have any experience working with youth, K-12, or any type of youth, this is the place to add your experience and input. And then for everyone, what types of programs are needed to ensure that youth can easily access internet-related careers? So when I first read this, I thought, well, every career is related to the internet today. You have to have digital skills for every type of career. But if we're thinking about the jobs of tomorrow, what do the youth need to make sure they can thrive in tomorrow's economy, right? So if you have any experience or expertise in these areas, definitely add your comments here. Okay. With that, I would like to invite you to join our community if you're not already part. We have monthly community calls, we have a newsletter. Again, we operate first and foremost as a community, so we'd love to have you. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions. And we will answer them. Let's see if anyone wants to add their questions in the chat. We can try and get to it. Amanda has let everyone know that the next community call is April 21st. We'd love for you to attend and join us. Drew, yes, I see you had a question about question 9. It's there in the PDF. Yes, Megan, everyone does not have to answer every question. Sion.
I wanted to raise a question that I saw in the chat that the nuances might be better conveyed verbally. Okay, so there was a question, can you clarify how the scope of the Digital Equity Capacity Grant differs from the competitive grant program as it is broadly legislated? So thinking about, if you're a local community, community-based organizations, what's your best shot at getting funds to fund local digital inclusion efforts? Obviously, they can apply directly if they're eligible through the competitive grant program. But what should organizations be thinking about through their capacity grant program?
That's great, Sion. Thank you for raising that. I'll give my 2 cents, and if Angie's in a place that she can answer too, she can jump in. If you are not already engaged with your state or territory in their planning process, I would do so now. Many of them are on the road right now, having community listening tours, informational sessions, all sorts of things to learn the needs and both the needs, but also the assets within the state. And so I would first and foremost encourage you to engage in that planning process. The capacity grants, again, I don't know if I explained this very well, are going to be granted to the states and territories to then implement those plans, right? And once they implement the plans, they may choose to subaward some of those grant funds out. They may choose to implement them at the state level. Our recommendation, I'll be very clear, is that they should do a mix of those things, that they should sub-award out to folks like you that are on the ground, but there may be some places where there aren't folks like you in communities, and so they'll need to implement some statewide programs. So that may be a potential avenue of funding for you in the future. The competitive, Congress did stack these intentionally. They did not want overlap. So they do not want, Congress did not intend for programs that are funded through the capacity awards to also be funded through the competitive awards. So now, or maybe potentially the same organizations may be funded, but the specific project or program, I think it's unlikely. So again, I'm not the funder here. So if Angie has additional ideas, my recommendation is to get engaged now with your state, and then also potentially pursue the competitive, because that could also be an additional source.
Yeah, Amy, I'll just kind of emphasize that the eligible entities under the competitive grant program are eligible as subgrantees under the capacity grant program. So you do not have to wait until the competitive grant program is released. And I always say you need to get to the planning table so you can be at the capacity table. So it is important. So I don't know if you, I'll drop in the chat as well, the internetforall.gov website, which you can go on and click, and it will provide you with the contact information to your state broadband office so that you can, get on their lists or find out where they're having these listening sessions, and attend, and not just attend, but bring a friend. And what we've encouraged states is that if you know everyone in the room, that means that you have not reached deep enough into the community. And this engagement will not stop with the planning process. It is intended to continue on throughout the implementation.
Absolutely. And I think there was another question around how do you engage a state digital equity officer? Again, NTIA has on their website the point of contact. And if that point of contact can't be reached or the email bounces back, then there's also the point of contact for the federal program officer, and they can help get you in contact with the right people. So definitely encourage you to reach out. Individually, they need to meet you. They need to know what you do and the great work that's happening. A note quickly about how we, NDIA, will be submitting comments. So we take what we hear from our community and we sort of aggregate that into comments and then submit them. We won't be posting a template or recommendations for what to submit. Instead, we will host a working group session, and then also, again, a listening session where we're inviting NTI back. It's in the chat, whatever date it says in the chat, to listen and hear from you all. And we will submit those comments that come up during that listening session on your behalf to NTIA. So that's how we'll be submitting comments. And then I see Cheryl has a question around resources, recommended evidence to support replies. So we do have some research on our website. I would encourage you all to think of your own experience as evidence, right? The work you're doing, the information you're gathering when you work with people individually or collectively of what works, what doesn't work, that's evidence, right? So document that in your comments to NTIA. Angie, do you have any other suggestions?
I would just say, this RFC is encouraged, we wanted to make it as inclusive, as possible. So you don't have to, have, academia research, your experiences, is evidence. And I don't know if I'll just touch again. And so we, wanted to make it accessible so you can either upload your comments through regulations.gov. You can email us your comments to digitalequity@ntia.gov, or you can even mail us your comments.
Isn't that great? You can do all three. I love the email option. Well, with that, we are at time. So I would like, again, to thank you, Angie, for joining us today, and for your wisdom and expertise and your deep care for this issue. Our community is lucky to have you. But I'd really like to thank all of you that joined us. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate the work you do and all of the wonderful things that you do for your communities. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye, everyone.